Welcome to the No Fear podcast and the No Fear live broadcast. I'm your host, Coach Blauer. If you're into mindset training, performance psychology, personal development, you'll dig this new format. No Fear Live is a unique broadcast, and it's different from the No Fear podcast. We decided to go live because we wanted to create the opportunity to interact with people like you all over the world, where anyone can log in and ask questions, and in some cases, you may even get invited into the show. The great thing about the live broadcast is that it's much more personal for the listener. That's you. Remember, self-defense isn't always about a confrontation with someone else. The first and most important fight is winning the one inside your head. Holy moly. Every time I watch that video, I can't wait to listen to the show. I'm like, who is that guy? It looks so good. Richard Norton.
I still don't know, Tony. Who is that guy?
Dude. So first of all, thank you so much. You know, just people don't realize this, but we've been trying to do a podcast for a long, long time. You did stuff with a bunch of mutual friends of ours every time you were over, but our timing never worked out. And I'm so glad that you finally squeezed us in. And I don't know how many people are going to log in, but we reshare this on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple and all that. So people will see or listen to the video, and hopefully people, if you get a chance, watch it, because we're going to share a bunch of pictures and other stuff from Richard's career and talk about that and go crazy with things. But can I name drop where you're going today, who you're going to visit for the next week? Because for my martial
absolutely.
So we've got to cut this short because Richard has to go hang out in Hawaii for a week with the great Chuck Norris. So that's so amazing. People must be freaking out. I mean, I remember reaching out to you in the 80s, and you were just really, making your mark in action films and stuff like that. And people, the magazines weren't what they were like today. There weren't that many of them. So people didn't know about your bodyguard work and to the degree they know now. It was the movies that were like, oh, there's Richard Norton. And a little background for people who haven't read the post I've made about you in the 80s. And I wanted to preface that because I wanted to explain how our friendship started and then ask you a zillion questions.
Okay.
But in the 80s, I went to Black Belt Magazine in 1980, and I walked out of my car. And this is a funny story. On the way to Black Belt Magazine, I had to pull over and throw up. I was so nervous, man. You talk about no fear. I had, if my shirt was on, all it said was fear. I literally had to pull over the car and throw up, Richard. I was so nervous because Black Belt was the iconic,
that was it. That was right? The Bible.
Yeah. And so I throw up, I get out of my car and I'm walking to my interview, 1980. And who walks out of the building on the way there is Chuck Norris, right? And I'm like, oh my God, this is Chuck Norris. Holy shit. And then I'm in the lobby and Bong Soon-han's there and all the pictures. And I'd been there a couple of times. I'm just going to talk about myself the whole show. Thanks for logging in.
Yeah. You do that. No, this is good.
You can go get some coffee or something. But but I want people to understand the significance of this, because I was blown away. I was 20 years old. These icons, these legends, and the walls, Mike Stone, Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, I was like there. And over the next few years, as I began writing for the magazines and really kind of leaning into what I believe my path was, I saw a bunch of articles and I said, you know what? Who is the next generation of Mike Stone, Bruce Lee, Joe Louis? And I started seeing you, and you like, man, I can't believe you're 73, but like your genetics, your physique, how young you look. And I'm like, okay, these are the people I'd like to communicate. And I'm not going to mention any other names because none of them answered me back. The only person that answered me back was you. And we met was it Jerry's Deli in Valley.
Yeah,
Wasn't it?
Jerry's out. Yes,
Yeah,
Ventura Boulevard. Yeah,
yeah. And we met there, and there was no ego, there was no bullshit. It was just this two martial artists who were connecting because of martial arts. And I always remembered that. And we've been friends for decades now, over 20 years, always staying in touch. And I wanted people to know, because that was significant, because I'd reached out to people saying, hey, we should be interacting and pushing the martial arts and having conversations in the same way that Joe Louis and Mike Stone and Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris and Ed Parker and those guys. And nobody fucking answered. And back then, of course, there was no email, but it was like, write a letter, pick up a phone. I left my phone number. Anyways, thank you for that, because that was,
you're welcome.
That was the launch. So let's do this, and feel free to interrupt me and insert whatever you want. I'm excited to share your life's work and what I feel that you represent, friendship aside, is like a true martial artist. You're always studying, you're always training. And my two favorite moments of you as a martial artist was one time, again, your schedule is always crazy. But coming to one of our combatives camps in Vegas, where you just signed up and sat with the audience and did the drills. And you're like one of the best martial artists in the world, but you're there. You don't need an entourage. You don't need, okay, can I come in the back door and let's have a little table for me to sign autographs. It's just like you blended in there. And the other one was also coming to the gig I did in Melbourne, where you just showed up and sat there with the audience, and most everyone knew who you were, but they're like, holy shit, like that's Richard Norton just sitting there, right? And I think that's fantastic, because a lot of people, when they get to a certain status, they want the treatment to be a little bit different.
Yeah, Tony, I have a favorite saying that, our arts, I don't want to sound too derogatory, but there's a lot of wankers out there, they're validated by belts, by title, by all the colors they wear and everything. And my saying is, heaven forbid they unfold their arms and get found out for what they don't know. And you talk about fear. The fear is being exposed. I think it takes a lot of guts to actually, what I call, dare to participate, to actually get on the mat in an area you're not comfortable with, and more importantly, in front of people that you see as students or whatever. People are very fearful for being found out for not knowing everything, and how the hell can you? And I think, I got that. Well, I have that a lot here in Australia, but I particularly got it from people like Chuck, because what people don't know about Chuck, even when he started to get to fame through the movies, as you know, he was already a world champion was point karate back then. But as I would say, anyone who becomes a champion at whatever it is you do in that environment at that day has got my, I'm just blown away by that, and I'm digressing a bit now, but for instance, people would say to me, well, Chuck wouldn't be able to beat a Conor McGregor, or someone like that this day. And I said, well, what a ridiculous comparison. He was the best at what that environment produced back then. And I believe Chuck, born 30, 40 years later, would be that MMA champion, because it was about his desire to be better. And the one thing I got from him was that he was never afraid to sort of expose himself. When I trained with Chuck, I got there into the States in the late 70s, 79. And we'll get into how that happened. But I do remember that part of what we did was just trying to find out who was on the cutting edge, whether it was a George Dillman or with his pressure points or whatever. We would sort of find that out, and Chuck would invite them over to the house. Let me see what you do. He was very interested in what they did and was willing to get on the mat and be a student. And I thought that was huge, because, my name compared to his is like minuscule, but he was willing to just get on the mat and be a student. And I took a lot from that, and another great example is that when we started training with the Machados, and Chuck, Bob Wall, and myself helped set them up in their very first school in the Valley. The first person on the mat wearing a white belt was Chuck Norris. And I
Wow.
thought, what better example than that? Chuck Norris, who would be forgiven for wanting to sort of think, oh, well, I'm supposed to be Chuck. I'm supposed to know it all. He didn't care, Tony. He put a white belt on and was on the mat. And I thought, wow, that's huge. And I took a huge leaf out of that book, from people like Chuck. So as I say, daring to participate is a huge part of everything we do in life. And again, one of them is just daring to step on the mat and get involved. Benny Urquidez is a great one. If he, we would talk, he would do seminars all over the world. And so many times, whoever hosted him, as in the master or whatever it is, would end up sitting on a chair watching the seminar and watching all the students, which used to irk him a lot, and whenever the actual instructor would get on the mat, line up as part of that learning sort of environment with the students, he would always make an example of that. And he would point out how much of a warrior spirit that instructor is showing by being okay for not knowing it all and getting on the mat and actually participating and adding to whatever knowledge base they had.
It's very funny. I remember you. I don't know if you remember this, because our time together is always a day here, 3 hours here, a cappuccino here, whatever. But I don't know if it was our first trip or another trip. You brought me over to the Machado School, where I was humiliated. It was just I got in the class there, and it was like. I don't remember which brother it was, but it was, I describe it as he had as much trouble with me on the mat as, let's say, someone trying to pull cotton balls out of a cotton. It was very easy. And it was scary. It was scary to be under or being touched by somebody who truly understands jiu-jitsu.
Well, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. And by the way, hence the saying that we used to have back then, leave your ego at the door, because if you don't, it'll probably be put there for you.
Right.
Especially in an area that we were very unfamiliar with as stand-up fighters, and obviously wrestlers became part of that whole equation later on. But as a martial artist back then, you would look at kickboxing and boxing and all the stand-up arts, but we never really factored wrestlers in. And of course, the UFC changed that whole perception when people saw how quickly a good wrestler took a good stand-up fighter off their feet and put them on their backs. And, my memory of that whole journey started when, I'd met Renzo Gracie and I'll go back. The whole journey of jiu-jitsu started when Chuck went to Rio de Janeiro for a holiday, and he was with Bob Wall, his wife. And of course, being a martial artist, he wanted to sort of find out what martial arts they did there, asked around, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. And he ended up in the school with Helio Gracie, Rickson Gracie, Royce Gracie, who was just a kid then. Can you imagine? And they started talking. He had a little role with Helio, and that's a whole other story. Chuck said he's on top of Helio, who would have been in his 70s then. And Helio apparently said to Chuck, try and punch me. He was on the mount position, Chuck was. And Chuck says, oh, Mr. Gracie, I can't do that, and because Chuck would have been in his 50s then. And he said, no, go and punch. And Chuck said he kind of half-heartedly threw a punch down. He said that's all he remembers. Helio had put a cross-collar choke on him. Chuck said he couldn't eat for 3 or 4 days, and that was his intro to the whole idea of jiu-jitsu. He brought a tape back to Australia of Rickson Gracie's very early Vale Tudo matches, and that really started a lot of the notoriety of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in America. I'm not saying it wasn't there already, because Horion was already there, but somebody of Chuck's stature sort of spouting, how amazing Jiu-Jitsu was, is what started it off. Anyway, I ended up looking up Horion Gracie. I found out he was in Los Angeles, and I rang up and said, look, Mr. Gracie, I'd love to come around and basically see what you guys do. And they were in a house in Redondo Beach, no studio at all. Hickson was there, just teaching out of a garage. So I turn up in my motorbike, and the first thing Hickson says to me is, "Oh, my friend, you want to put the gloves on?" Because we spoke and knew I had a stand-up background. And luckily I was smart enough to say, no, 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 no. I just want to see what you guys do. So cut two, my very first introduction was hoist Gracie on his back, and I had to sit on him in the mount and try and stay there. Flip it over, and Hoist is sitting on me, and I have to try and get him off. Obviously no striking or anything like that, both of which were impossible. And I just remember still to this day walking away from that first introduction going, oh my God, I felt like a little baby on the mat with these guys. And I thought, how good would it be to add this skill set to what I did? And the important thing was I was smart enough to not go instead of what I did, but as well as what I did in order, to supplement what I already did. And that's what started the whole journey of adding Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to my skill set. But same as you, mate, to go there to this strange environment as a fighter, knowing you're jumping into the deep end of a pool that you'd never been in before, it's frightening. But God, I can't imagine my life as a martial artist had I not jumped in the deep end and bothered to get on the mat with these people. Again, not knowing, the whole history and what they do. But I think that's even more scary when you're jumping in an area that you have no knowledge on. But anyway, best thing I could have done, So
yeah, one of the things I say about because of people see not the facade, but the external billboard of spear and nonviolent postures and all that. For some reason, there's many people that assume I'm anti-grappling, not realizing I wrestled as a kid. I've done jiu-jitsu on and off for many years, but I do it specific because I'm so busy with what I do, because I recognize this, and I wanted you to maybe speak to this, because while you've gotten very skilled and proficient at grappling, you are really a stand-up striker. I mean, that's where you lean, your body type, your movement, your timing. And I always tell people that the hardest person to take to the ground is somebody who's not afraid of the ground. And the only way you won't take the only way you can become unafraid of the ground is to spend lots of time on the ground. And it does something to your situational awareness and your stand-up skill when in the back of your mind you go, you know what, if I do get taken to the ground, I know what to do, but I would like to solve it here, striking, or spend my time here. What are your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. What you're saying is basically make friends with the ground, friends with the ground, because when I started, there were a lot of stand-up fighter friends who said, well, we don't go to the ground. I said, well, okay, that's all very well, because they're talking, a lot of them were doormen and security people and all of that. And, that I believe I would never choose to go to the ground, the street, but we can talk about my attitude on that too. But I just said to them, look, I train with a guy called Sam Greco, who was K1 at the time, used to play around with him. He was K1 world champion, MMA fighter, Kyokushin world champion. And the guy's a moose, he was 230 pounds of muscle. And we used to play around. And I said, if someone like Sam Greco gets his hands on you and decides you're going to the ground, guess what? You're probably going to the ground. So the question now is, can you survive? Can you survive that situation and get on your feet and get back into what you believe you do best, as in striking? Maurice Smith was a good example. I don't know whether you know, Maurice Smith was a amazing MMA fighter back in the day, with Tank Abbott and all these sorts of people. And
K1,
I spent Yep, and I spent some time with him, and he said, look, he said, there's no way I can get as good as these Brazilians or whatever professional grapplers. He realized, he said, but what I have learned to do is how to survive. Basically be on my back, not get punched out. Mind you, with the UFC, they had that inactivity rule, and after a certain amount of time, they'd stand you up. But that's okay. He was playing to the rules. He realized as long as he couldn't be got, they would stand him up, and then he's back to leg kicking and everything else. And I thought that made perfect sense. Because talking of the ground, we used to work doors here in Australia and then the bodyguarding work, as I said, I realized the only time I would choose to go to the ground is if I was in the middle of a football field, there was nobody else around, and I knew I was a better grappler than the person I was fighting.
Right.
Flip side is, or that I had 3 or 4 people of note around me that could watch my back, and I wanted to take somebody to the ground to diffuse the situation without punching them out. But I needed to know there wasn't somebody, there making 3 other people coming around and wanting to kick me in the head.
Sure.
So I think, I think that was an important part. And the other reason I think grappling, even in today, and again, I'm getting off in the different areas here, is people have got to realize this is a different world when it comes to violence. As you know, clenching a fist now just represents extreme violence in the minds of the average populace. Back when I did door work and even bouncing work, there were no CCTV cameras. It basically, if you got into it, it got down to what you said happened and what he said happened, But now everything is on film and you have to justify the use of this. And
Sure.
you might be completely in the right, but still end up in a shitload of trouble in a civil suit or whatever, because your reaction was considered above what I call a low-level response to low-level violence, meaning if somebody puts their hand on your chest and shoves you or swears you and you suddenly smack them and break their jaw, that would be seen as an excessive response. It's not commensurate with the threat. Hence, grappling, I think, is a phenomenal low-level response that you can control people. Maybe I always said I would rather, if I lost a fight, I'd rather get choked unconscious and knocked unconscious. At least I don't get my jaw broken and my teeth knocked out. But at least, yes, you don't want to lose. But and I'm saying hypothetically, if I get choked out and I wake up and I'm all good. And I think having even the younger ones, the kids and everybody else that we teach, giving them an alternate to gouging eyes, taking somebody's throat out, or whatever, is an essential part of today's survival skills. Always knowing that at any time when you grab, when you do what we call, BJJ combatives, that you can punctuate it with a strike at any time should the need arise. So adding the grappling skills is very important. And again, I watch a lot of the Krav Maga, which is amazing, but I still think I'd be very concerned with the younger ones learning these skills because, God, Tony, you know better than anyone on this planet. If that's all you know and you're in a state of extreme fear, you are going to react with whatever you have trained into your nervous system. And that involves gouging somebody's eye and whatever. Imagine a kid in a schoolyard getting pressured in the normal old bullying days that we go through at school, and that's what you respond with. I think with grappling knowledge, you at least lessen the chance that response is going to be extreme.
Well said. Good point. You referenced door work and security and stuff. I remember, and I don't know, share what you want, but my first trip to Australia, Nicky was 9 months old. He's like 32 now, so like 31 years ago. I was hearing these rumors about the Zendokai guys, and they were the badass, and there was all these like watch out for the, and I met a bunch of them and they were super cool with me. I guess, people are cool when you're cool with them. But tell us a little bit about that beginning, that background, and how you got into security and bodyguarding and all that, because that's a fun journey.
Sure. Well, my martial arts career started when I was 11, so we're talking 1961. Thank you very much.
I'm going to stick up a little picture here while you're talking about that.
And I was, as I've often said on podcasts, I was very skinny, very small as an 11-year-old, but I tried judo. In my mid-teens, there was a friend I trained with that trained judo with us at high school that mentioned there was a karate school opening up 3 miles from where we lived. And I went along, and this was a gentleman named Tino Severano, who was a Hawaiian Filipino. who'd been out in Australia maybe 6 months. Tino's considered right now to be the father of Australian karate. It was a Goju system that he taught. Anyway, I went along to this demonstration, was just blown away with it. It was a very fundamental demo, but I thought, oh my God, this is what I need to do. This is what I have to do with my life, because I saw it as, unlike judo back then, it didn't involve a lot of strength and size and everything else. It was agility and moving around and blah, blah, blah. So I joined up with that. Now, in my years training with Tino in the late 60s, Bob Jones was also a student. Bob was 10 years older than me. Bob already had an incredible reputation in the streets. He ran security at, I always laugh, by the way, I say at the discos. As soon as you say discotheques, that really dates me. But
Google it. Google disco.
Yeah, Google what a disco is. And so, we became really good friends. And again, Bob was a very, very powerful man. As I said, just nobody that I knew had more experience in the street than Bob. Loved the traditional karate and what it added to his skill set. Anyway, it came that Bob wanted to basically start his own eclectic system. Eclectic meaning that it wouldn't be just blinkers on Japanese style, but we would introduce other areas of combat that would make the style more effective for the type of students, being bouncers and doormen and security people. So we would add boxing, and a bit of grappling and all that sort of stuff even way back then. So it was a bit of Dendokai for me was a bit of a precursor to what we now know as MMA or mixing martial arts. So that's what our club was, and it was tough, man. I always said, we started Zendokai in 1970, and I always said what we lacked in finesse, we made up with blood, sweat, and tears, because I was still a kid, and these are tough doormen. Every night there were broken teeth and noses and lips split open, and it was a mindset that
the good old days.
Oh man, which you couldn't do today. You'd lose your house, your car, and everything else. You'd be sued. But that was what it was back then. So as a result of that, I started in the late teens. Bob got me working on the door of these local clubs. So I got to be around just some incredibly seasoned street fighters, that worked as security and everything else. So that was an incredible learning curve for me, because I didn't come from that background. I grew up in the suburb of Croydon. It wasn't a rough neighborhood. I wasn't getting beaten up by gangs. That's not why I got into martial arts. So that was a real eye-opener to be in that environment. But what an incredible sort of journey that started for me. It was a couple of years, would have been 1973, that there was a local promoter named Paul Dainty, an entrepreneur that brought all the top rock and roll acts out to Australia. And he rang Bob and asked if we would be interested in looking after the Rolling Stones when on their trip to Australia in 73. And we knew Paul because there was our equivalent of Woodstock, in the early 70s at Sunbury Pop Festival, it was called. Same sort of thing, out there concert, 3-day sort of a thing, all sorts of issues going on. And that's how we met Paul, and you realized, our value, in the security area. So that's what started my bodyguarding work, was working with the Stones, with Bob. I used to teach Mick Jagger reverse punches at 4 o'clock in the morning, which is pretty fun.
This is crazy. So basically, you started at the bottom with the Rolling Stones as your first.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I always say, what an introduction to rock and roll. Right. I mean, my godfather, and what was great about that, aside from the actual job, is you're right. I mean, I look back at the time. It's not as
hang on a sec. I lost your audio. You're muted here. How do we unmute? Hold on a second. There you go.
We're back, right?
Yeah. Go back a minute.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying that, working, you say, oh, what a way to start. yes, I realized how big it was, but it's actually 20, 30 years later you look back and you realize how significant something like that is.
Sure.
Because at the time, it's just a gig. It's like my first movie with Jackie Chan. People say, "Oh God, how was it working with someone like Jackie Chan?" I said, "Well, I didn't really know much about him at the time. For me, it was just
Right.
another gig." You know, it's when you see the eyes of the younger ones go, "Oh my God, you work with Jackie Chan." So anyway, that's what it was, and the great part about all of that work, and especially working with like a Mick Jagger, being around Keith Richards and Charlie Watts and all of this, was I got to sort of see the real people,
Mm.
because we see the persona, we see the actor on stage playing out a role, but to just sit and chat with people that are at what I would call at the absolute top of their game was an amazing experience, and not just amazing, but an amazing learning experience.
Right.
Because we went on to work with Fleetwood Mac, ABBA, David Bowie. I was with David Bowie for 8 years, Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor for 14 years. And I'm getting on a different area, which I love to talk about, but I got a chance to learn so much from what I call people at the top of their game, because you
Mm.
don't get careers like that with the longevity they have without there being certain ways of behavior that sort of add to that longevity. And I saw incredible parallels with that in martial arts. Um, for instance, like, Lindsey Buckingham and Fleetwood Mac, there was never a day on the tour bus traveling around the United States or whatever that Lindsey wasn't sitting there playing with that guitar, trying to find new notes or whatever. He didn't go, "Well, I'm already a world famous man. I
Right.
don't need to be any better." And David was the same. Linda Ronstadt, there was never a week when Linda wasn't trying to find another voice coach that could help her hit a note in a slightly different way, because Linda is, she's a lot of younger ones wouldn't know Linda Ronstadt, but back in her day, she was as big as Beyonce. She won 10 Grammys, sung operetta, rock and roll. She did Pirates of Penzance with Joe Papp in Central Park. And her skill set, and again, I learned from that. I thought, wow, talk about never being satisfied and always being the student. And I thought, that's why she has a career. That's why she's as good as she is. Which gets back to our original conversation in martial arts. You should always have the student mindset. There's always something to learn. And even if there wasn't, how good is it to find something that you're so passionate about that makes you want to get up every morning and try something new? And if you stunt your growth and decide you've already achieved or got enough knowledge or are good enough, I believe that journey stops. And I saw that in these artists. They were always striving to be better than they were the last concert. David Bowie, I was standing with David watching a whole lot of people and crowds. And I remember David looking at, he said, "Rich, have a look at them all. They're all dressed like I was the last tour." He said, "They will never catch me looking the same." How cool is that? Like, he was a chameleon. In other words, he
Right.
wanted to keep reinventing himself. And that gets back to martial arts. For me, I've always said, I don't want to be the same martial artist I was 5 years ago. I need to be growing. I need to be evolving. And that means finding new aspects and new areas that I don't have knowledge in that can challenge me. And again, just make me excited enough to get up and try something new.
Amazing, amazing. That last kind of metaphor and story reminded me of one of my favorite quotes. I don't know who said it, but it goes, "Be willing to give up who you are today for who you could become tomorrow." And it's that
Yeah.
continual, evolution. And it's funny when you talk about intuitively, I like to think it's how I do my best to guide my team of trainers. If you ask any of them, "Hey, what was your best course?" they will always look at you and answer, "My next one." And they know, like, we're always, and when I work with fighters, I go, "The guys studying your last fight, your previous tapes, you need to reinvent yourself." You can't, and it's one of the reasons why, and I know you see this, guys that on the pro level where they don't have that Lindsey Buckingham or Linda Ronstadt or David Bowie mindset. So if it's kind of that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type thing.
Yeah.
And they start to lose because their game is so predictable. But there's a bigger. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And oh God, sorry.
It's all right. We still got you.
My ears aren't made for these little iPod thingers. So, yeah. But I do recently. Well, not recently. Last few years, as a friend of mine, Matt Ball in Zendekai, that brings out a gentleman named Alex Kostic, who's a Serbian Sistema teacher, but it's not the Sistema that probably you're used to seeing with the Russians on video clips. He has his own interpretation. He was an amazing karate guy and kickboxer and everything else, and he went to Sistema, which, by the way, intrigued me by itself because I want to know what made you choose this system of Sistema over what you did. Anyway, the point being, I've done a number of seminars and hung out with Alex. And the first thing I said to Alex after doing a class with him, I said, Alex, you're doing my fucking head in, mate. I said, a lot of what you do is so contradictory to what I already do. And I said, I don't really have time to learn a whole new art per se, but I'd love to learn some principles of what you do that help me do what I already do that little bit better. And that's exactly what I got out of it,
Mm-hmm.
And just being on the floor with him has changed so much of what I did in the most minute way, but the most incredible way, and again, because I just get excited at applying a new principle to what to anyone else would look like the exact same punch or move or whatever it is. But I was able to sort of influx a little bit of Alex's sort of teaching, which helped me incredibly. And again, the easiest thing would have been to look at it and go, that's not what we do, that's shit.
Sure.
No, but you go, well, if it's that popular over the world, there's got to be something good about it, and this is the advice we used to give our Zendekai students when they went to tournaments, say a Taekwondo tournament, Shotokan tournament. And I'm talking in the days where martial arts was very blinkers on. If you did Shotokan karate, that's all you did. Or if you kickbox, that's all you did. It wasn't that mixed martial arts world. But I said, rather than going and automatically taking the view when you watch other people fighting tournaments and go, well, that's shit. Well, we're better than them and da-da-da. I'd say, well, the fact that it's been around this long, look at it and try and figure out what is it. If there's got to be something they do that is good that you feel you could add to what you already do. And it might be just a 1% or 2% increase, but that means you've improved by 2% rather than having a negative view of 98% of it, and I think that's important for people to sort of take that on board.
It's a challenge. And I think in many ways that kind of myopic blinders on the side stuff still exists. It's funny how history repeats itself. But even today, my experience is you get a lot of that tunnel vision of, no, we do Krav or we do MMA or we do jiu-jitsu or we do, and I do these. I'd like to think they were meaningful lectures on this kind of the danger of having that myopic point of view, where I always run things through the street filter where I go, if you're training only kicking, then your neural patterns, your distance management, and everything you're looking for is a situation where kicking will solve the problem. If it's the same for grappling or striking or pressure point or anything, where when you're studying true violence, you need to look at the bigger picture. Should I be running the hell away? Should I be barricading? Should I be charging the threat? Should I be de-escalating? And if you're unconsciously drawn into, I'm going to take this guy down and choke him out, or if he pushes me one more time, I'm going to kick him in the face. And there's so many stories like that, but there's a real danger at the neural patterns and how it affects situational awareness. And that's nerdy shit we don't have to talk about. You know me, I always like to get into the brain and neuroscience stuff. But you're 100% right. And it goes back to, and I hope you're going to write a book or an article or talk more one day on the you've been around like in the film world for certainly the action film, from Jackie Chan to Chuck Norris to in the music world at the top, and you've seen people at the top of their game, and you could probably do an entire seminar, if not write a book on, what is the art and science of winning at that level, and what does that look like?
Yeah, and I would say commitment for a start. It sounds like I'm name dropping. It's just some movies I've done, doing Suicide Squad with someone like Margot Robbie, or Ghost in the Shell with Scarlett Johansson. I had to go to New York and train Scarlett for a few months.
By the way, I get to interrupt. Like if either of them want my number, it's okay. I spoke to Jessie. She said it's cool. Just feel free. Give them my number.
Margot was asking about you, but said Tony's pretty busy. Margot, I'd rather not pass out his number.
Okay.
Good
stuff.
Yeah, but when we were doing Suicide Sites, for instance, and Margot, of course, is playing the Harley Quinn role, or again, Scarlett was in New York for a couple of months and in LA training them, getting them ready, basically giving them the tools that they would need for the type of fight scenes they would need to do. But the one thing that struck me again is the commitment. Is every day they would turn up no matter what for that training. And during the shoot, at one stage during the first Suicide Squad, I said, Margot, even if you can give me 20 minutes at the end of the day to keep enhancing the skills you're going to need as Harley Quinn, those huge fights you had to do. I said, if you could just turn up, and I tell you, mate, every day after a 12-hour day, she would turn up still with her makeup on and commit. And I said to people, that's why they have the careers they have. Right. That level of commitment, understanding that they need to add that skill set in order to be the best version of themselves. Scarlett was the same. We would go to a shooting range in New York because I said, look, you're going to be shooting guns. You can't be blinking and carrying on because you've never heard the loud retort of a weapon and everything else. You've got to know what it feels like, the kickback, even though we know you're using blanks back then on the set. But I said, you need to know what that world is like. So when you're on set as that character, everything you do in an action sense should be as though you've been doing it since you were 3 years old, every day of your life. And they would commit. I mean, there's some actors that I've had that are training because they've been told they have to. But when you get people like that, Will Smith was like that as well, worked with Will at his house for months. When they watch you, when you're explaining a punch or a move or a bit of footwork, and you see they're just absolutely absorbing every detail and exhibiting it when you get them to do it, as opposed to just half listening and half not. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was fascinating because in a sense, they're what we're talking about. They're martial arts. They're actors. They're taking on a character, but they still, that pursuit of excellence is what's important to them. And all, I love Napoleon saying that confidence is a factor of preparation. I think that is so wonderful, which of course he's talking about warfare and everything else, but that's what we're talking about, right? Is whatever it is, you could be an actor playing Harley Quinn or Scarlett or Tom Hardy playing Mad Max. The more prepared they are when they walk on that set, the more confidence they'll have when playing that character and being that character.
But I want to piggyback on that, but also put this out there to everyone listening to this. Like that is a universal truth for life. There's two things I want to expand on this. Number one is, a lot of times you see somebody pops into a movie or shows up at a fight out of nowhere. It's out of nowhere. And it's that, the overnight success after 20 years, as the joke goes, right? So if you think about it, you started martial arts in what year?
61.
61. Holy shit. I was 1 year old. And So I started training in, let's say, 1972. I don't think I've missed a day thinking about martial arts. I've certainly missed some days working out because of travel or injury or sick or burnout or whatever. But I've been doing stuff my whole life, as I know you have. And, when you talk to, an athlete or a musician, um, part of what I hear in the stories you're telling and the messaging is, the commitment. A lot of people, when they think they've arrived, they stop doing what got them there. And that's where shit falls apart. But the ones that have exceptional growth and trajectory or sustainment are the ones that either intuitively or intentionally continue to practice, to continue to develop their craft and be the best they can be. And that's that commitment. But I want everyone to think about, you hear stuff and you go, wow, that was a great takeaway. I'm going to apply that now. But applying that now might be the day one journey that's going to take you somewhere in 20 years. And then you're going to experience this success.
Yeah, I think, Tony, it's about just never be satisfied, never be satisfied with where you are. There is always something you to learn. And there's a book I like to quote. Buckminster Fuller wrote a book called The Critical Path. And I always say it's a motherfucker of a book to read. You got to be like a rocket scientist the way it's written. And I'm breaking just little things that I got from that. And one of them is about goal setting, where he talks about goal setting never quite being as satisfying as you think it would be when you reach a goal. It might be, if we use me, for example, I grew up in Croydon, suburb of Melbourne, and say I start karate, and I just think, if I could win the Croydon Karate Champ, that'd be it. I'd be happy. I'd have achieved, really achieved something. That's all I'd need. So I win it. Suddenly it's not as fulfilling. Oh, what if I won the Victorian champion? What if I then won the Australian championship? And he talks about that's all about bodies in motion, meaning that anything that stops still long enough is probably dead, whether it's a plant or an animal, or a human being. Once it stops, it's probably dead. And that's the purpose, is that goals are never as fulfilling. It's meant to propel you into setting a new goal and a new goal and a new goal. I mean, that's what it's all about. So that's in line with what we're talking about with martial arts. Never be said. There's always something new to learn. And you might go back to what you did 5 years ago, but that new lesson might just confirm that whatever you thought was shit is really shit. But you won't know it unless you give it a try, if that makes sense, So I think that continually sort of striving to just, again, just be a different version of you. Look, art is all about individual expression. I would say that if you and I had, and three other people had a tree, and you're asked to paint that tree on a canvas, every canvas that we paint would have a different version of that tree. The tree hasn't changed, but our individual expression of it had. To me, that's martial arts. It's taking in all these variables and then expressing it in your way, which might be better than or not as good as somebody else, but it's still art. It still becomes an individual expression. And I think, again, you'll only get there by continually experimenting with whatever expression it is that you're into in whatever area of life. Because here's the other thing that I believe that most, and I'm generalizing, and I don't mean this as an insult to a lot of everyday people, but I just think so many people are just waiting to start to live. They do a job they could do in their sleep. They go to home and they watch the same TV shows, and then they go to bed at the same time. Then they get up the next day and repeat the same shit all over again. And they're waiting, but when I get to 60 or when I get to 65 and retire, and then I'm going to travel and I'm going to do this, to which I would say, well, good luck if you make it,
Right.
But the difference with what we have, and by the way, a lot of them are using pre-learned skills, like you learn to ride a bike when you're young, or you shoot basketball hoops, or you play cricket or football or whatever it is. But the value of what we do, and especially as martial artists, is every day of our lives, we have a chance to learn something new should we have the desire. And I thought, how fucking good is that, that we can keep reinventing ourselves, keep adding to our skill set, testing the plasticity of the brain by taking on a new complex skill. Shit, look at jiu-jitsu. When I started doing that, that's the most complex martial art I've ever learned. Why? Because of its evolution, because it's allowed itself to evolve almost by the week because of being battle tested in the UFC and tournaments and everything else. A lot of the jiu-jitsu that I learned 20 years ago was almost obsolete. That's an exaggeration, but there's a certain amount of things that you got to completely relook at because of the Gordon Rhines and everything else and where they've taken the art. So the evolution is what, again, makes something like jiu-jitsu so incredibly exciting. Because see, the trouble with, not the trouble, but a lot of the traditional arts we learned, they don't change because they want to stay like they were 100 years ago. So they haven't evolved to today's combat environment. Again, something like jiu-jitsu, or I would argue Krav Maga and things like that, they do at least evolve to suit the modern combat arena. And I think that's very important that we jump on board, realize that, and realize that every day is a chance to become a better version of you.
I love it. I love it. I want to, you started talking about movies and stuff like that. And I know a lot of, and then it shifted and came back to martial arts, and probably most everybody in my audience, law enforcement, military, martial artists, self-defense. So that they're going to dig that, and we'll come back to that. But I want to talk about the movie stuff a little bit, more selfishly for me. How did you get involved with the stunt work? What was that transition from being a bad guy and then to, like, you've done the fight choreography or actor prep for fighting on like some of the biggest movies in the world now. And it's like you say, when you say, hey, it's not until like 20, 30 years later that you look back and go, holy shit. And so that people who've never done stuff that's kind of like that outrageous for the average person, in the moment when you have an opportunity like that, you're just, in some cases, the momentum is so extreme that you don't realize what you're doing because you're trying to do the best job you can. And then it's afterwards, you're like, whoa. And then in other cases, you're just a professional doing it. And it's when you step back, you realize how significant that event was in the history of the world. So what was your, how did you get into movies? Obviously you're friends with, Chuck and other greats. So it was like, well, Richard, I'm doing a movie. Of course, come in here, let me beat you up. And then what was that transition, movies to stunt work? And then how did that move into, getting calls like, okay, come choreograph Mad Max? That's insane. Another giant.
Yeah, well, it does get back to Chuck Norris. In 1978, Bob went over to America, to look around. He'd originally actually spoken to Joe Louis, bringing Joe Louis out to Australia again. For those younger ones, Joe is not with us anymore. He was a legendary point fighter around the Chuck Norris time. Anyway, Bob met Chuck Norris, ended up bringing him out to Australia to do some demonstrations at some tournaments that we were staging as part of Zendo Kai. In fact, they were the first kickboxing matches probably in Australia. The PKA, if you remember, that was a little different from Muay Thai. We weren't even introduced particularly to the Thai style of kickboxing. But anyway, Bob brought Chuck out in 1978. And Chuck came out because he had just done Good Guys Wear Black and Break a Break, a couple of his very, very early action movies. And so he was demonstrating and I was demonstrating on the same card. I was doing demonstrations of Sai, an Okinawan weapon and the bow or long stuff. So I was doing on the same card. Chuck and I became really, really good friends immediately. And in a nutshell, he said to me, if you ever get to California, look me up and we'll do some training, which you can imagine for a little Croydon boy in the suburbs of Melbourne, what an amazing invitation that was.
Yeah.
Not thinking that I would end up in the US, but a year later in 79, after working with Linda Ronstadt in a tour, Linda wanted me to come and work for her full time in the US. And this is, by the way, gets to the daring to participate. I remember that invitation being, oh shit, I've got clubs here. I'm so settled. I thought I don't really want to leave Australia. And Linda ended up saying to me, she said, why don't you try it? You can always go back home. In other words, it was a bit of an out for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, you know what? I absolutely. So off I went. And in retrospect, had I not dared to step out of my little fishbowl and jump into this huge fishbowl, I can't even imagine what my life would be today, Tony, without the impetus and taking that invitation and daring to actually step into a very scary US arena. Well, as soon as I got there, I rang Chuck up and, told him he was in town. We started training every morning at his house. I mean, one of those pictures you showed, we used to train at his house in Rolling Hills Estates. And they were 3-hour workouts we would do, 6 days a week. He trained as hard as anybody you could think of. And he was also in the very early stage of The Octagon, his action movie where I played Keo. Not that one, but,
I don't know
wearing the crimson headdress and everything else, because Chuck realized I could handle the Okinawan weapons that the character needed. The character was supposed to be Asian, technically, which is why the mask came about and they blackened my eyes out. So, and it was great because I almost became the Darth Vader of martial arts with that role. And that was really my first intro into movies, was through Chuck. I met some amazing martial artists on the set. I played a character called Long Legs, where you saw my face, and Keo. And then Aaron, Chuck's brother, Aaron Norris, and a couple of others, we did all the ninja work, climbing up buildings, all the fights with Chuck, because we knew him so well. We'd rehearsed at his house beforehand. So that was the start of my movie career. And I remember being on the set with people like Tadashi, Yamashita, and Philip and Simon Ree, who all in the infancy of their own careers, but came on to be amazing coordinators. I thought, how good is this? I'm actually following my passion and getting paid for it. I mean, it doesn't get better than this. I did a few more movies with Chuck. I did then, through Pat Johnson, who was a friend of Chuck's, got offered. He suggested I audition for this film called Force 5, which was being directed by Bob Klaus, who directed Enter the Dragon, and Freddie Weintraub was a Warner Brothers producer who produced the movie, who also produced Enter the Dragon. So I had to go and audition for Force 5, which gets into our area of fear, by the way, that I go into this audition. There's probably 100 of the best martial artists in America, Bill Wallace and Keith Vitale and Benny Urquidez, all auditioning. And I remember thinking, fuck me, what hope have I got? I've got a funny accent, being much more Australian sounding than nobody knows who the hell I am. So I auditioned. We're throwing the kicks and punches. And I'd already been training with Chuck for a number of years. So it got down to the final 10, and I'm still one of them. And that was a huge shift in my attitude, Tony, that day, because I remember thinking, well, if I'm in the final 10, I must have the skills they need for one of these lead roles, And that's where we get into the area, which I know you're a believer in, of visualization. I started visualizing myself in front of Bob Klaus and Fred Weintraub, sending this energy out, whatever the X factor is, and having them go, there's something about him that's interesting. I think we should give him a shot. Well, the rest is history because that was my first lead role. I got cast as that character Ezekiel in Force 5, and away I went. And that led to me getting, I've done 60, 70 movies now, albeit a lot of them low budget movies when I was acting, but who gives a fuck, I
Right.
got to travel the world doing what I loved, in the Philippines and Thailand and Greece and Hong Kong, of course, with Jackie Chan. But the idea again of I don't know that start and the visualization, because I'd love to talk to you about that as well, how important that visualization is, and that's a whole separate little chapter for us to discuss, because it was instrumental in my bodyguard work when I was doing demonstrations, or for instance trying to get a job on a movie set. It was huge. But that's, to answer your question, that's how the whole thing started, and it's still going today. Now, the stunt work really came as a result of me being on movie sets that were action-oriented, doing action movies, that you couldn't help but learn a lot of what was required behind the camera, because I was on the camera having to do it. I was working with other stunt people, and that's how I learned that part of the game. These days, I would probably be doing more fight coordinating than acting, but that's just a product of age.
Sure.
At a certain age, you are just a product on screen, and they would obviously prefer to have the 30 or 40-year-olds or younger running around, rather than having somebody of my age. So I always laugh that these days I'm probably going to get cast as an aging gangster or somebody's grandfather, but I don't care. I'm still working and being around amazing people, still getting to do what I do. And there are a couple of other leads coming up for me still that are very age appropriate, that I'm absolutely excited about doing.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's so fucking amazing, because like the lineage and the legacy and everything is amazing. And I'm okay to dig into the visualization bit, because it's intrinsically tied to the whole fear management. I mean, I knew Pat Johnson. He came to Montreal to do a movie. I ended up stunt doubling Robert Conrad, the original, Wild Wild West and blah blah blah.
Yep.
And he was a hero, childhood hero of mine, and here I am, being his stunt double. And I remember on the set the first day when they cast me, he's like 5'8", I'm 5'8", same sort of build, and I was like, okay, cool. I can't believe this. I'm like a Robert Conrad. I grew up in the '60s watching that, and then, oh my God, Pat Johnson. I mean, he's one of the guys that got his ass kicked by John Saxon and Enter the Dragon, and he's now this famous. So I'm all excited. I'm on the set of stuff. The first day of the set, I'm wearing a shirt that Sugar Ray Leonard gave me a couple years earlier. It was his brand. He had the Franklin brand of Sugar Ray Leonard boxing, and you couldn't buy this anywhere. So I wear it on purpose on the set because, as you probably know, Robert Conrad loved martial arts and was kind of a semi-pro level boxer, just loved to box. And I wore it on the set because I knew he'd look at it and come over and talk to me, which he did. We're at the craft table and I'm getting a coffee and I'm standing there like pretending not to see him over there, noticing him he walks over to me and he said, how'd you get that shirt? I said, Sugar Ray Leonard. He looks at me and I go, I have a boxing gym. He goes, how many bags do you have? I said 10, and I have a ring. He said, I'll see you at 6 a.m. And he came every morning before the set to train. But what was crazy is we became friends, and I want everyone to listen to this. In this era, I don't remember when it was, in the 1990s or early 2000s or whatever, but Conrad comes into the gym one day, and I knew he was going to be in there. I told one of my guys I wanted to see how good I am, because I'd like him to put me in movies. I really believe that I could choreograph shit, that I could fight, and I could be an asset. And any Bruce Lee junkie wants to be an action star. You want to be, you must have been pinching yourself because you grew up, you see that stuff, and then, oh my God, all of a sudden, like, you're doing this.
Hmm.
So I'm in the ring. He walks in. The door's open. It's like 6:05. I'm already in there, and I tell my sparring partner. I look at him. I go, okay, here's Conrad. And I look at him. I go, I'm so sorry. He's like, what? And I'm like, whack, whack. And I just start like we're going at him, but I just unloaded. And Conrad looks at me. He goes, dude, I would not want to meet you in an alley. And I'm like, we hit it off, and we're talking. And he says to me after the shoot, the same thing that Chuck said to you. He said, if you're ever in California, look me up. And you remember he became president of SAG and he had his own production company.
Right.
And I was too fucking scared to go, dude. I didn't go. And we stayed in touch. I'd go a couple times, but I didn't move.
Right.
I went in there, and what I did is I talked myself out of the dream. And everyone listened to this. This is why when I get on the bandwagon about managing fear, it's not because I came up with a cool fucking acronym or something. It's because there were things that have happened to me in my life because I've managed fear. And there are things that I wanted to happen that didn't happen because I mismanaged fear. And part of that is use the term visualization. I love the acronym false expectations appearing real. When Robert Conrad, one of the most at the time connected, influential actors in Hollywood, said, come out, I got a production company, I'll find work for you. I contemplated, I checked flights, I did that. I got a wicked adrenaline dump. I got scared, and I focused on what if it doesn't work? But I didn't have, you bastard, I didn't have my Linda Ronstadt to say you can always go back to Canada. And I stayed, and that chapter, that window closed. Isn't that crazy?
I think what you're talking about is what so many experience just daily in their lives, Tony. You know, what is the saying? Fear keeps people ordinary. You know,
I never heard that. That's great. Say that again.
Yeah, fear keeps people ordinary.
Wow.
Because you're too scared to just, again, to step out of that, whatever you perceive you are. It's fearful. Listen, you know, I still teach seminars all the time on grappling, on reality-based stuff. And of course, God, mate, I've plagiarized so much of your stuff, you know, because I don't know anybody that's done more research and made their life researching that whole area of fear and modern day combat and everything else. And I use it all the time. But my point is, I don't think there's a seminar where I don't get fearful. Fearful in that, well, shit, am I fit enough? Am I good enough? People are going to think, oh, let's see if Norton slowed down a little bit or whatever. But hence that saying that I love, you know, that I don't know who came up with it. Jeff Thompson's a dear friend, and just amazing books on the whole area we're talking about. But that saying that fear is a friend of exceptional or extraordinary people, because what I realized that the fear is what propels me to prepare more. Hence that, you know, confidence is a factor of preparation. So it makes me train harder, it makes me research, it makes me update whatever it is I think I'm going to teach, so I don't look like a clone of a year ago. So the fear is what propels you. Now, again, it'd be very easy to find an excuse not to do it and walk away from it. That's easy, you know. People like to use fear, whether it's, oh, I'm getting older, I'm injured or whatever. They use them as psychological crutches to never participate fully anymore, because participating fully is fearful, you know, because especially what we do out in the front of people in classes or even on a movie set or in front of actors, you realize you're kind of on show. You know, you're supposed to be the subject matter expert, and you don't want to be found out again for being found out for what you don't know. So I just think the fear is essential. I remember looking at Nicole Kidman in an interview once where she basically said, and I know this applies to a lot of actors, she said she won't take a role unless she's fearful, because being fearful makes her prepare more, makes her do more background work on the character and everything else, because she's scared shitless she's going to be found out for not having a clue about what she's doing. And that just applies across the board to what we do in so many other areas of life. And again, I repeat, fear keeps people ordinary, and that's a huge part. So I think it's a good thing as long as you use it in the right way. Like Benny Urquidez, I remember Benny, and these are all lessons that I'd love to say that I've learned from people at the top of the game. But Benny, way back, I started training with Sensei Benny before the Jet Center was even formed. You know, we used to train at his brother Arnold Urquidez's house in Mission Hills. There was an old tin shed. It was boiling hot. And what an intro to the whole world of Benny the Jet and kickboxing for me, because I was a traditional martial artist. And Benny, I remember Benny saying when he's talking about getting in the ring, he said, I never, ever got in that ring without having done my homework. He never got in thinking, gee, am I fit enough to go 10 rounds? Can I punch hard enough? Can I kick hard enough? He said, I never got in without doing my homework, which again is preparation. And he said, that way, if I got beaten, it was absolutely because the other person was better, not because I wasn't prepared. And that's a huge lesson right there, you know. And it's in doing, you know. I love the saying that there's knowledge and knowing. Knowledge is, yes, you've seen it on YouTube and you've read it in a book and you know what the shape looks like. The knowing part is the doing, that you actually get out there and do it. And I've been lucky to just be around so many doers, you being one, Benny Urquidez, the list goes on and on, Chuck Norris, whatever. They're absolute doers, and that's what it's all about. But again, it takes guts sometimes to step out onto that mat and actually do. You know, a great thing, a great example of somebody actually overcoming a fear. And I love this story that Chuck told me. He used to train, you probably know the Steve McQueen back in the day, legendary actor. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but they were having dinner, and Chuck had recently closed down hundreds of his schools, decided he wanted to go in a different direction. So he says, Steve says to him, so Chuck, you've closed all your schools. What do you think you want to do now? What are you going to do? And basically Chuck said, oh, I don't know, da, da, da. And Steve said, well, have you thought about acting? And Chuck said he laughed and basically said, oh, Steve, I don't know anything about acting, da, da, da. And Steve responded, says, wait a minute. So you've been training us for years with board breaks and everything else, telling us that if we commit and we focus, we can overcome any obstacle. And now you're telling me that you don't think you can do it. And Chuck said he laughed and he said, well, I didn't say I couldn't do it. That's what propelled him to go after his career, which became, obviously synonymous with any other martial artist that's achieved anything in the acting world with Chuck's career. But it was just that idea that he actually laughed as though, oh, acting, I don't know anything about that. In other words, bit of fear about something new. And it was prompted by what Steve said to sort of just jump in the arena, as it were, and the rest is history. And I think that's another great example.
It's crazy. So let's do this. I want to see, guys, if you're on the call listening, you got some questions, start posting them in there. I want to show a couple of pictures that I have of us, from, look at this, no tattoos on the far left there. That was when, I don't remember, that was a Maya show like 20 years ago or something. It's one of the super shows. And then up at in Malibu.
I'm wearing a chest pad in case because you look like you're going to punch me, Tony.
Yeah. It's one of the original high gear shots on there. That was at the combatives camp in Vegas. What else? Okay, pop that out of there. Get rid of that, at least. Cool. And I'm trying to think. There was something you said that reminded me of something else, but let's take we do have a question from John Chipman about Aikido, and I'll pop it up there. You can read it there.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, but to anyone who can't read that, he's saying that at one time I studied Aikido. Listen, I did dabble in Aikido, but probably just enough to hurt myself. I'm by no means proficient or whatever, but he's asking, well, did it enhance or hinder my development in other systems? No, absolutely. The little bit that I did learn, and it was with a gentleman named David Brown here in Australia, which again most probably wouldn't have heard of over where you are, but an amazing practitioner. And I do remember doing some stuff with him. And the thing I think I learned from the Aiki was how subtle it was. They used to say in Aikido that you start with a big circle of understanding or technique, and eventually it becomes like a dot, meaning a lot of what you do almost becomes imperceptible. You know, the overt movements that you see can be quite invisible. And he used to sort of shape up with me. And by the way, we never sparred per se, but I do remember one day saying to David, I said, David, I know you're offsetting my center and my balance, but I can't see what you're doing and how you're doing it. And that was intriguing to me. Leading, by the way, to another parallel of that with Hickson Gracie, who has what he calls his hidden jiu-jitsu, you know, where a lot of what Hickson tries to teach is almost imperceptible to your eye. You need to feel it. You need to be on the mat and experience it to know how much minor detail is the contributing factor to the overall result of what Hickson used to do. But to answer your question, no, I got some principles from Aiki that I absolutely applied to all what I'm doing, jiu-jitsu as well, if nothing else, one being energy, you know, leading energy, not trying to be so combative with the energy confronted with, which, as we know, Aiki does, they'll redirect your energy and lead you into a lot of those throws and everything else that they do. So, yeah, no, I think I always get something. And again, my lesson, as I said to all of you earlier, is no matter what it is you're doing, if you go into a totally negative mindset from the beginning, you will probably walk away without having improved by even 1% of it. If you can go in trying to find that something that you can take for it, even if you discard 99% of the rest, again, I would say you've improved by that 1%.
I love that. And I got a question for you. So your perspective is so evolved. How do you, and I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, because I've gone to so many, I've been around so many different conferences and training events where you see people, and there's a part of my brain that is always looking at what's flawed. I can see what's good, but I really wrestle between, like, oh, that's not practical, that wouldn't work, or that's good for him, he's a unicorn, but that's not transferable to students. And I got all this chatter. You seem to have always had this. It's so I guess, was it just like a gift that you had, Richard, or did something change in you where, like, back in the day when you had way more aggression, testosterone, early Zendokai days, and you'd go see like another martial art, were you always the sponge, or were you going, I'm gonna show them how good I am, or this system? What created this humility? Because it's really rare. I mean, I don't know if you feel that way or recognize that. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I don't really know the answer. I've obviously been influenced by people that have made me think that way. But Tony, I'd be lying if I said I could come up with a direct answer. I think Tino Soberano, as my first karate instructor, was obviously instrumental. He, the old thing when you start something like martial arts or whatever it is that you don't know whether your instructor is good or bad because you don't know anything. It's only later on you realize you've either wasted a lot of time and money, or both, or the opposite is true. And I don't believe I could have had a better start to my martial arts journey than with Hunchy Tino, and his attitude, his nurturing, his caring for the students, and his passion. I mean, it wasn't about economics back then. It wasn't matter how much money he was making. It was just about trying to make us the best martial artists we could be. And he would often invite other people into his school to demonstrate or to train with us, to be able to test ourselves on. And I think that's also quite interesting. And I know a lot of people that will refuse to embrace whatever else is out there, especially bringing another master into their own school, for the very reasons I said earlier. they feel like they're going to be exposed for not knowing it all, which is just I just don't understand that mindset. So maybe I got that from Tina, obviously from Bob. Bob, we back in the day in the early 70s, every now and again we would bring so many different people in, like Hari Krishna people would come in and we'd get lectures from them on what they did, or a Chinese martial arts. We used to have a gentleman, William Chung, who was, supposed to be Bruce Lee's senior, a student of Ip Man. He was in Melbourne, I interact with him. There were so many people that we would have access to that we would actually source knowledge from. And maybe that's also what's given me that attitude that it's okay to be an open book and to be inclusive. And, this is, and this, by the way, this being open to, yeah, I mean, I'm answering your question in my own mind as we go.
Sure.
That I thought Zendikar and Bob, and the fact that you're talking about visualization, that started with me. We had a gentleman named Tony Rafferty, who back in the 60s, and that he used to have world records for running from like Melbourne to Adelaide, which is, 500 miles or whatever it is. We brought him in to give a talk on world-class physical achievements, like for him, long distance running. And Tony started off by saying, he said, you probably think I'm going to talk about exercises I do and how I get fit and all of this. He said, I'm in my 40s. He said, I'm competing in this record sort of world with people half my age. He said, it can't be just about that, to which he went into his whole talk about visualization. And Tony said he used to, and again, I'm trying to make this short as I can, but before a run, he talked about, he used to go to a hypnotherapist called Dr. Ainsley Mears, who wrote a book called Relief Without Drugs. He used to go to the dentist and have wisdom teeth pulled without having anesthetic and all this sort of stuff, using the power of the mind and hypnotherapy. So Tony went to him and he said, before a long distance run, he said, I would get down and get into my alpha state, which is that non sort of judgmental sort of mental state where you go into and out of with hypnotherapy. He'd get into this alpha state. He'd visualize himself sitting on a chair in this little cave that he manufactured in his brain. And he used to, I don't want to get too detailed, but you look up at 45 degrees and you can trigger this alpha mindset, these alpha waves. So he would visualize himself going down, sitting in this chair. He would set up, by the way, in those days, it was just a movie projector with actual film. He'd set this projector up, he'd pull out the screen, he'd sit back in the chair. And again, I'm talking like this because he would see himself fitting this image and I'm talking about it. And then he would watch himself doing that run. And he said, I would see myself starting. He would even see little dogs coming out and nipping at his ankles. He would see newspaper reports. Rafferty does it again, another world record. And he would do this for weeks before the run. So his whole point is, and I'm telling stuff that you would already know, but he said, when it came time to doing that run, he said, I'd already done it 1,000 times perfectly. It was just a matter of doing it again. Because as we know, the imagination cannot distinguish between imagination and reality. It's rather the consciousness can't, your subconscious can't distinguish. So in his mind, he'd already done so. It allayed all the fears he had. Can I do it? Am I able to do this? And we know how prevalent visualization is all around the sport, whether it's putting hoops in basketball or golfers visualizing where the ball's going to go. That's huge for me, that one seminar. And again, getting back to the original thing of being open to inclusion of other knowledge, Tony Rafferty changed my life with that, because every demonstration I did, for weeks, I'd visualize what I was wearing, the reaction I wanted the crowd to have, including the time that Chuck was in Australia, the first time he saw me and I'm on stage demonstrating. And I would just visualize every aspect perfectly. So when I got up to do it, I had the confidence in my subconscious as if this is just doing it again. There's no fear here. Interesting enough, on that one demo, I nearly lost 2 of my toes. I was halfway through this demonstration And I thought, and I was wearing the hakama, which is that divided Japanese sort of skirt, very traditional sort of thing. I remember thinking, wow, my toe feels weird. I'm in the middle of two guys, one with a sword and one with whatever. And I looked down, and where my second toe from the back was supposed to be was just hanging on with a bit of skin. And the other one I immediately thought was broken. And what's funny, interesting at that very moment, this is in nanoseconds, I remember thinking, well, that wasn't part of what I visualized. But I remember thinking in my mind, well, I've trained too hard for this. Chuck Norris is here. And again, I'm talking nanoseconds of going through my brain. I said, I'm not going to stop now. And I finished another, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes of this demo. Just being, the one thing I wanted to be careful of is one of them didn't step on my foot and rip the high toe off. And off I went. In the end of it, I didn't feel any pain at the time. And that was a real interesting thing for me too about visualization. It was like, because it wasn't part of my preparation, I almost wasn't willing to accept that and react like I normally should have. Went to hospital, had microsurgery on my toes, and all is good. But visualization is something that I then carried on and still do to everything I do. I mentioned about Force 5. That, I believe, was instrumental of crossing that finite line of what separates me from the others that were up for that role of Ezekiel, and I got that. I did it in my bodyguard career. I would try just about every tour I did to visualize every possible scenario of somebody coming up from the left of the stage. Because again, doing bodyguard work, I was like the last line of defense. You have local security. I would put the security where I wanted them to be, depending on the act. I would tell them, well, don't let people approach the stage till X part of the show or not at all. Blah, 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 blah. And then I would be on the edge of the stage in the dressing rooms or whatever with the artists, bring them out to the show. And I would just visualize every possible scenario of somebody coming from here, there, somebody with a knife, maybe there's 3 people backstage, whatever it was, because I also realized that at least if something happens, even though, of course, it would not be in the complete same image that I was visualizing, but to a certain extent, it would not be as though for the first time. It would be, for all intents and purposes, something that I had already encountered before, albeit in my subconscious and in my imagination. But again, a subconscious can't distinguish between imagination and reality. So I believe that I was already giving myself a lifetime experience in that combat sort of area when it came to what I was doing as a bodyguard. And I think visualization is just such an underused tool.
You've had amazing mentors from the get-go, and it really shows in that perspective. That's fantastic. And I was thinking, like with my students, the same thing, not to the degree of Tino and some of the others, but I remember being friends with the Hilton brothers in Montreal and having great respect for boxing and having them do private boxing seminars for our place. I had my friend Walt Lysak come up and teach jiu-jitsu and grappling after I went to the first UFC with him, and in 1993, and afterwards in the hotel room, I was like, is this stuff fake? Like, why would you tap if somebody grabs your ankle like that? Like, why didn't he just sit up and boom, just punch the guy in the face? And Walt looks at me and he goes, well, it's actually very painful, and you can break an ankle, break a shin. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I got a pretty high threshold for pain. We sit down on the floor. I give him my ankle. He cinches it in here. He goes, you feel this? And I go, yeah, but I would just sit up here and I lean forward to go punch him. And he does the classic. He goes like this, Richard. He goes, and I felt my shin bend in the opposite direction. And I was like, fuck. And my whole nervous system did one of these, like, oh, it didn't hurt, but I couldn't move. Yeah. And after the demo, I was like, dude, you know all this stuff? And he goes, yeah, my dad's been teaching us this stuff for years. And I'm like, how come you never told me? He had been bringing me to his school, and I would just go down and do my seminar. We'd go out to dinner and leave.
Yeah.
I didn't know, it hadn't even occurred to me to ask him. Well, he just said, hey, I want you to do a seminar. When I saw he had this whole skill set, I started bringing him up to Montreal to show our guys. But it was very, very interesting. I'm fascinated by the whole thing, and we could talk forever. We got an interesting question here from Troy Young that dovetails nicely here. How did you handle failure if you ever had to? I'm going to answer that for Richard. He's never failed anything in his life.
What a ridiculous question, Troy.
Right?
I mean,
Come on, Troy.
as if.
You know, and it's funny. Before you answer it, I remember in Chuck Norris' first book, the line I'm paraphrasing where he says, you know, I've never lost a fight in my life. Although I've got a bunch of L's, I've always learned, and I can't consider that a loss. Something like that. That whole mindset of what did I learn?
Yeah, well, you know, there's a thing about entering tournaments. You know, people not entering tournaments because they're fearful of losing. But the better thing is to enter, and even if you lost, you haven't lost because you just defeated yourself by entering in the first place.
Right.
If that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So there's only winning and there's learning, not losing. Oh God, I've had a million failures, but I've learned to be very accepting, Troy, because that's also just a nature of life. I mean, you can visualize all you like. It doesn't mean that's going to all come to fruition, and maybe, just maybe, universally, it's just not the right thing for you anyway. You know, you can always factor that there's a larger sort of source that's saying that's not right for you, even though you believe it would be. So a failure might actually be a better thing for your development in your life. And in fact, you know, the old thing is, oh shit, I've done it again. Sorry. See, I just failed to keep my ear pod in. God, how embarrassing, Tony. See, I just failed.
We'll cut that part out. They're just remember when Bruce in the interview with the black and white interview with, I forget, that Walter Cronkite, I think it was, or was it Walter Cronkite, where he drops the lapel mic and then he tries to catch it and he fumbles it, and while he does it, he goes, "I am a highly trained martial artist," you know, like just self-deprecating. So there you go.
I you know, there's nothing better than having a role models be fallible and being capable of not always winning. I think that's comforting at the very least, you know. But again, you know, it's like jiu-jitsu, as they say, if you don't tap out, you know, if you're in a class and all you're doing is tapping everybody else, then there's nobody there that can really teach you anything, you know. It's in the getting tapped out that teaches you have a flaw in your game. You need to work on that aspect, and hopefully the next time you encounter that same situation, it'll be a different result for you. So, you know, the amount of, like in acting, for instance, you know, and by the way, Tony builds my acting career up. Bless your little heart, Tony. But, you know, a lot of the movies I've done, I don't care. It's about the journey for me and who I've met, and I've had an incredible time doing it. But, you know, if you go for 20 auditions in a movie and you get called back once, you're actually doing pretty well. You know, so you've got to be realistic too about that overall thing. You can't win at everything, and again, maybe it's just not right for you anyway. And the important thing is, though, that you keep getting up. As they say, it's not the fighter that wins every fight; it's the one that gets knocked down and gets up again and continues to fight. And I think that's what we're talking about. You know, you keep trying, you keep going, you keep growing, you keep learning. Whatever it is you think caused you to so-called fail, then you have every ability to do something about that, or moan and groan and go away and sit in the corner and feel sorry for yourself. You know, I think that's mainly what it's about.
I love it. That's a great answer. Let's do one more question, also from John, who asked the Aikido question earlier. He's asking, did you ever have a situation where a student or someone in the audience or whatever surprised you and you had to adapt to the situation that either validated or invalidated a technique?
Yes, yes, and yes. There was one time I had a student named Chris Stansfield, and I'd been teaching this spinning back kick that again I'd come back to Australia and I'd learnt from Chuck and a few of the lads we used to train with. And I remember teaching this, and I'm sparring with Chris, who was a brown belt at the time. I went to throw this magnificent punch. He spun around and caught me in the floating ribs with this back kick. And I remember again in nanosecond thinking, no, I'm the sensei, I'm not going to go down. And I just dropped to my knees in an absolute mess. And all I could say was, great kick. It was like, but again, as we would say, well, what more proof of that than what you've been teaching actually works? I mean, he caught me flush. So I wouldn't consider it a failure. I thought that was great. I remember Carlos Machado, teaching a technique, and he said he had a blue belt student. Now, Carlos is Master Carlos. I think he's a 9th degree in jiu-jitsu. And he was rolling with this student. The student tapped him out with the technique that he'd been teaching. He said, well, I'm never going to tell anybody that happened. But he remembered thinking to himself, well, at least I know it works, Right. So, hey, happens to the best of us,
It's an interesting thing. It's that tricky line, John. It's an interesting question because I used to spar with all my students, and there's a part of your persona, the idea of who you think you are and what you represent, that you wanted them to know you're always the instructor and you're always better than them. And then there was the idea of like if they can't make the stuff work, what are they learning? So we would do stuff where we had a rule that if you after I really got into the ground fighting and submission and our scenarios, we had a rule that when you beat somebody with this, when you totally dominated a student, when that moment was over, you had to show them how you did it. And
yes.
And what that did is it made you think through the protocol, almost like being able to explain chess with muscles at 100 miles an hour. But then what it did is it lifted the game of the guy you just tapped out or the guy you just caught with that counter, which meant that it wasn't going to be as easy for you the next time if they embraced the lesson and took it to heart.
A good example of that, Tony, is 10th Planet, Eddie Bravo. Sure. I mean, I remember, Eddie, for those who don't know, was a student of John Machado, came on to, basically put his own system together called 10th Planet, have incredible results in MMA and other forms of combat. But he said, he told me, he said, I have a chance to train with some of the best MMA fighters. And the thing he realized was best for him, whenever he learned a new technique, he said, I would go and teach that the next day to all my students, but not withholding. The old thing that the master, I better not teach a student everything because maybe he'll beat me with it. He wanted to teach them everything he knew about that technique because he wanted them to then come up with a counter to that technique, because he would then have to come up with a counter to a counter. What a great way for the evolution of the club and the style and the students. And, I thought that was very instructive as well, because, I mean, that's whatever, you can't know everything, See, my answer when I got back kicked, I should have said, well, of course I let you do that, Chris.
Right.
We'd love to say that, but that wasn't what happened. He got me flush, but yeah.
And it validated the instruction and the technique. So
I mean, we always, the old saying that your ultimate job as an instructor is to train a student to become better than you are. And by the way, that's another thing that a bit of a lesson for me as a 73-year-old that I try and give to a lot of the instructors that are starting to gain in years. I said, you need, I had one jiu-jitsu instructor say to me here in Melbourne, well, if I can't beat every one of my students, then I'm going to give it up. Cut to a few years later, he's given it up. Because I would say to them that age alone will dictate, that you do things differently. Meaning that if I was to say a 40-year-old and I have 10, 20-year-old students, given that we all stay perfectly healthy and train, at some stage in my life, whether it's when I'm 70, 80, every one of those students will be able to beat me. Age alone will dictate that. So get over yourselves that you have to be the very best. Your job is to illuminate the way for those younger students with your journey and your lessons you've learned, and help them to be the best they can be. A great example of that for me is Freddie Roach, who trained Oscar De La Hoya and Manny Pacquiao. To think that Freddie Roach has Parkinson, my wife could probably do a round of boxing with Freddie, not quite, but you know what I'm saying. So the fact that he could get in and last a round with him is totally irrelevant. The reason that Manny Pacquiao and Oscar De La Hoya worship someone like Freddie Roach is his ability to make them the best versions of themselves and to become world champions. And I think we need to remember that, to have suicide matches every day if you like doing what we do. You won't be sitting here like we are talking about it now. You'll be so jacked up. And think what a waste that is if your ego is such that you have to beat everybody every day of your martial arts life. There'll be a day where you can't even walk on the mat. Well, what a waste of a journey when you can't share and give knowledge, related to your journey because you can't even walk in the school anymore. So Helio Gracie, Horian Gracie told me that Helio Gracie, at 94, he died at 95. At 94, he said, my dad was still drilling every day at 94 years of age. And he said, basically, he said he wouldn't have got there by having survival matches every day he got on the mat. And that was incredibly instructive, because at 94, I mean, to be doing at 94 what your whole life's passion has been, it doesn't get better than that. And that's what I believe you're striving for, certainly what I'm striving for. I want to be doing this in another 20 years from now or more, and enjoying that journey. Sure, I can't be like I was 40 years, 30 years, 20 years ago, but I can still be the best version of me at whatever age that I get to, and just enjoying every day of it.
Amazing message. Let's wrap this up. I'm going to pivot here, and I hope it doesn't get too emotional because my mom passed away just over a year ago. I had, of course, tons of messages from people all over the world, but Richard actually called me from Australia, and as if I wasn't already crying, made me cry more with some very deep words. And we just have this message here from Ricardo, a big fan of yours, and I'll pop that up there because it just made me think of my mom there in the message. And I think that's what a wonderful little thing there. That his mom, and sorry to hear about your mom, Ricardo, but she took you to the cinema every day to watch all your old movies. What a cool memory and experience.
Yeah. Well, I sent you that message because I lost my mom, Tony. She was 94 when she passed on, and obviously it's something you never forget. She was, my best friend. So,
yeah, pretty heavy. Guys, we're going to all start crying now at the end of the show here. Dude, this was amazing. Thank you so much. We have to do it again. Is there anything that I didn't ask or we didn't talk about that you're going to get off and you're going to go, shit, I wanted to say this or do that? I mean, you covered so many things there. And every time we get together, I realize that the Richard Norton onion is deeper and has more layers than I imagine. I learn more things about you, and I respect you even more. So what a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed it. Look, it'd be great to get into more detail, even regarding the combat area, especially doing bodyguarding. Because I know you talk about it all the time. We loosely refer to it as being switched on. I'd love people to understand more of that mindset. Like in martial arts, a lot of times with karate or anything, it's always about what happens after the first punch is thrown. Well, I do this and I do that and everything else. But as you would readily point out, you've probably incredibly mismanaged for it to get to that point. So the pre-fight and all the pre-visual cues that lead to that are such an important aspect that we don't focus on in most martial art classes, because everything we do is again, I know, Tony, you would say is whether it's boxing, judo, MMA, whatever, it's all consensual sparring. I've agreed to fight you. You've agreed to fight me. There's probably rules as a sensei or whatever in the room. And it doesn't address, well, how did it get to the point? In fact, I think you were the first one that really drove that home to me with a headlock, that if we're doing a headlock, usually, okay, grab me, pull me over in a headlock. Now I'll show you to get out of it, which, as you pointed out, well, you're dealing with the worst case scenario, but how did you get there? What were all the pre-visual cues of dialogue, of aggression, of approach, of proximity? What did he do? Did he throw a punch that made you flinch and then grab you in a headlock? And I think I'd love to talk about that in the future, because I learned a lot from that little exhibition, for instance, of a headlock escape. And I used to have to always do that. See, the thing with bodyguarding for me is the last thing the band wanted me to do was punch somebody.
Right.
Because it wouldn't be Richard Norton punches a fan. It'd be James Taylor's bodyguard punches a fan or whatever. So I was very aware that it was about being switched on and absolutely being ahead of the game. Like, I'd go to a show, I'd scan the front row. It had so-and-so been drinking too much. Let me put a security guard. Just keep a guy on those. In other words, you would try and preempt the actual physical part of the confrontation. And that's a hugely important thing that I wish martial artists would focus on a lot more as well. It's being switched on to the environment, changes in their environment, the adrenal factor, which we can get into, what it feels like. Because I know what it's like to be scared shitless fronting off with some people, having to hide that, what Jeff Thompson used to call the duck syndrome, where you inside the duck's on the water and he looks all nice and smooth, and you look under the water, his little legs are going like the clappers. And that's your stomach churning and everything else, and moving your body position so you hide the fact that maybe you're trembling, and just disguising that absolute fear that you're feeling, going ahead with it anyway. I mean, they're all areas that I want people to know that your system explains and does better than anybody. And as I said, I had to preempt everything. I had to try and be ahead of the game all the time with an artist. And the second thing is that guided a lot of what I did with bodyguarding is that the difference with what I did as a bodyguard is I could never run away. I could never leave the scene, because I was responsible for Stevie Nicks or whatever it was standing next to me. So I had to be comfortable with close quarters proximity, because it inevitably started with dialogue and trying to dissuade, distract, or whatever, before any thought of violence. So my self-defense had to be applicable at a close range. You remember earlier on you talked about only learning great kicking skills. Well, we used to say a Taekwondo practitioner in a phone box in a fight is probably in a lot of trouble. So you have to learn to adapt your skills to the environment you think you're going to encounter. So there was that part of it again, which I'd love to get on with you again and give you my thoughts through actual real life experience. And the final thing, I'd love to tell you the story just because it intrigues me about, you try and remember where you were at a certain point of your life when things happened. That I used to go with, I had a fan once tell me in New York when I was working with James Taylor, I said, "Oh, why does James Taylor need a bodyguard? We love him." And I tried to explain, well, it's not the average punter. It's that 1 in a million out there that has a totally different agenda. So I'm sitting in Peter Asher's office. Peter Asher used to manage Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor. He was part of a duo called Peter and Gordon, which were as big as the Beatles in England that day. Anyway, I used to work Peter out. He was their manager. He's on the phone to James Taylor in New York. And anyways, I'm sitting there and he hangs up the phone. He says, "Wow, that was weird." He said, "James just said, well, gee, that sounded like gunshots." It turns out that was James was sitting in his apartment in Central Park West, and that was the shots of John Lennon getting killed by Chapman.
Holy shit.
Interestingly enough, James had been approached by Chapman the day before. He asked him for an autograph. James remembered this. But Chapman obviously James wasn't the highest one on his list. For whatever reasons, he wanted John Lennon. God, how chilling is that? But it's also an example of why why you need security and why you need bodyguards. It's that 1,000,000 chance that somebody has an absolutely out of this world agenda, and that's what you're there to try and at least prevent. So got lots of stories about things like that as well.
I would love, and I think our audience, we'll talk about it when we do part 2 on that bodyguard. I've got a course called Be Your Own Bodyguard, and it's not about the professional side, but it's still very, very relatable, because whether you're a cop, public safety, private security, all of your training, if my mic over here, if my mic is my bag, I'm controlling the distance to hit it. If I want to move it and elbow it, I'm doing that. If I want to practice an arm bar on it, I'm controlling all the distance. But in an ambush, the bad guy is controlling that distance.
Yes.
And it impacts you. The neurobiology is different. The psychology is different. The fear management is different. And you said something that's so profound. If you poke a single cell amoeba under a microscope, it'll pop away from a pinprick. At a cellular level, we move away from danger. But if you're, I'm not going to show the picture of you with Abba on this call. I want to talk to you about who did your hair before that gig and who dressed you, but we'll show it in the next one.
Very important topic, Tony. Yeah.
But you know better than other people. Like, you're here like this, and your job is to protect your principles. So it's not even like you're sparring or eyes on. There's this whole idea, the psychology around that. Definitely want to do a follow-up podcast when you're back and you got time, and we'll talk about the pre-fight, in-fight, post-fight preparation, visualization. Because guys, listen to this. Even if you have no interest, and I'll tell you what, that field is blowing up again because of the last 3 years, private security. But even if you're not interested in that, you're your fucking bodyguard. You're out. You're coming away from the ATM. You're in line somewhere. Someone bumps into you. Someone bumps your car. You get out. You're like, well, and something kicks off there. You're not on the mats in the traditional sense. So, my friend, safe travels to
Hawaii.
Yeah.
I hope I don't get sunburned, Tony. There's always a fear of that, my friend, on the beach.
No fear. Wear the no fear shirt.
Okay.
And, I want to see you replicate this picture of Chuck Stratton. You really need to work on your hip mobility a little bit there. And I want to see that picture of you and Chuck, recreate that, send it to me. And dude, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your story. You're an inspiration. You're an icon. You're a legend in the industry, and I'm grateful for our friendship.
Thank you, Tony. Absolutely the same, my friend. Again, thank you for all your knowledge. As I said, again, I plagiarize as much as I can from you and apply it in everything I'm teaching. I know you keep updating and you help me to keep updating. So appreciate the friendship as well.
Okay, guys, we're going to sign off, and we'll let you know when Richard's on for part 2.